The cargo bay of Mining Station Outpost 7 smelled like rust and regret. Captain Thomas Wade had made this run a dozen times before, dropping off supplies to the workers who spent their lives pulling precious metals from dead asteroids. It was boring work, but it paid well enough to keep his small transport ship running. Thomas checked his manifest again, counting the crates stacked against the metal walls. Something felt wrong. The numbers did not match. He was missing 3 containers, but the delivery receipt showed everything had been unloaded. He frowned and walked deeper into the storage area, his boots echoing on the cold floor. That was when he heard it. A soft sound barely louder than a whisper. It could have been the wind moving through the ventilation shafts, but there was no wind in space. Thomas stopped walking and listened carefully. There it was again. A quiet whimper, like someone crying but trying very hard not to make noise. His hand moved to the scanner on his belt. He pointed it at the walls, watching the screen as it showed him what was behind the metal panels. Empty space. Empty space. Then something appeared on the screen that made his blood run cold. A heat signature. Small and weak but definitely alive. And it was coming from behind a false wall that was not supposed to be there. Thomas looked around the cargo bay. He was alone. The station workers had all gone back to their quarters after unloading his ship. Station Overseer Mitchell had signed the papers and left in a hurry, which now seemed suspicious. Thomas pulled a crowbar from his tool belt and wedged it into the seam of the wall panel. The metal groaned as he pulled, and the panel came loose with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty bay. Behind the wall was a cage. Inside the cage was a girl. She was not human. Her skin had a soft golden color with patterns of white markings that looked like they might glow in different light. Large pointed ears pressed flat against her head in fear. Her eyes were huge and dark, filled with tears that rolled down her face. She had a tail that wrapped tightly around her thin body. She wore nothing, and Thomas could see bruises on her arms and legs. She looked at him with absolute terror, backing into the corner of her cage as far as she could go. Thomas felt sick. He had heard stories about trafficking in the outer systems, but he had never seen it with his own eyes. This girl was someone's property in the eyes of the criminals who had put her here. She was merchandise being stored like his cargo crates. He held up his hands slowly, trying to show her he meant no harm. She flinched anyway, making herself smaller. Thomas looked at the lock on the cage door. It was electronic, connected to the station's network. He pulled out his data pad and started working on breaking the code. His hands shook as he typed. Every second felt like an hour. The lock clicked open. Thomas carefully pulled the cage door wide and stepped back, giving the girl space. She did not move. She just stared at him with those huge frightened eyes, like she expected him to hurt her. Thomas grabbed a thermal blanket from his supply pack and held it out to her. She looked at the blanket like it might be a weapon. He set it down on the floor and backed away again. After a long moment, she reached out one shaking hand and pulled the blanket toward her. She wrapped it around her shoulders, covering herself. A small sound came from her throat. It might have been thank you in whatever language her people spoke, or it might have been nothing at all. Thomas activated his communicator to call the authorities, but stopped when he heard voices in the corridor outside. He recognized one of them. It was Overseer Mitchell. The man was talking to someone else and he sounded angry. "I told you to keep her sedated," Mitchell said. "If anyone finds her before the buyer arrives, we are all dead." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. The authorities could not help because the authorities were part of the problem. He looked at the girl in the cage. She was looking at him too, and somehow she seemed to understand that danger was coming. Her ears perked up slightly, listening to the voices getting closer. He made a decision that would change everything. Thomas scooped up the girl, blanket and all. She was lighter than he expected, weighing almost nothing in his arms. She made a small frightened sound but did not fight him. He ran toward the loading dock where his ship was waiting. His boots slammed against the metal floor, making noise he could not avoid. "Hey! Stop!" someone shouted behind him. Alarms started blaring throughout the station. Red lights flashed along the corridors. Thomas ran faster, his lungs burning with effort. The girl buried her face against his shoulder, trembling like a leaf in a storm. He could feel her heart beating rapidly against his chest. He reached his ship and slammed his hand on the door control. The airlock opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Thomas jumped inside and hit the emergency close button. The door sealed shut just as Overseer Mitchell and 2 security guards rounded the corner. Mitchell's face was red with rage as he pounded on the airlock door. Thomas did not wait to hear what the man was shouting. He carried the girl to the small medical bay on his ship and set her down gently on the examination table. She clutched the blanket tighter around herself, watching him with wide eyes. He grabbed a medical kit and started the ship's launch sequence at the same time. "I am sorry," he said to her, even though he knew she probably could not understand him. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe. I promise." The ship's engines rumbled to life. Thomas ran to the cockpit and strapped himself into the pilot's seat. His hands flew across the controls as he disengaged from the station's docking clamps. Warning messages flashed on his screen. The station was trying to lock down his ship remotely. He overrode every command they sent, pushing his engines to maximum power. The ship pulled away from Outpost 7 just as weapon systems activated on the station's defense platforms. Thomas punched the throttle and his ship shot forward into the darkness of space. Laser fire lit up the void behind him, but he was already too far away. The stars stretched into lines as he engaged the faster-than-light drive. They were safe. For now. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. He had just made powerful enemies, and he had no idea what to do with a traumatized alien girl who could not speak his language. He looked back toward the medical bay where she sat wrapped in her blanket. Her eyes met his through the doorway. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. Thomas had chosen his path and he would see it through to the end. Thomas set the ship on automatic pilot and returned to the medical bay. The girl was exactly where he had left her, sitting on the examination table with the thermal blanket wrapped around her small frame. She watched him approach with cautious eyes, her pointed ears twitching at every sound the ship made. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible. From the medical cabinet, he pulled out a scanner to check her vital signs. When he lifted the device, she flinched backward so hard she nearly fell off the table. Thomas stopped immediately and set the scanner down on the counter where she could see it. He pointed at it, then at himself, then at her. He was trying to show her it was safe, that he only wanted to help. She stared at the scanner for a long time. Her tail, which had been wrapped tight around her body, loosened just a little. Thomas picked up the scanner again, this time moving even slower. He held it near his own chest first, letting the device beep as it read his heartbeat. Then he offered his hand to her, palm up, waiting. Minutes passed. The ship hummed around them as it traveled through space. Finally, she reached out one trembling hand and touched his palm with just the tips of her fingers. Her skin was warm and soft. Thomas stayed perfectly still, letting her decide how much contact she could handle. She pulled her hand back quickly, but something in her expression had changed. The absolute terror had become something else. Caution maybe. Or the smallest seed of hope. Thomas checked the scanner readings from that brief touch. Her heart rate was dangerously high and her body temperature was too low. She was dehydrated and malnourished. He needed to get food and water into her, but he had no idea what her species could safely eat. He pulled up his ship's database and started searching through files on known alien species. An alert suddenly blared from the cockpit. Thomas ran to check the navigation screen. 3 ships had appeared on his sensors, closing in fast. They were pursuit vessels, probably hired by the traffickers. His little cargo ship was not built for combat or high-speed chases. He had maybe an hour before they caught up to him. Thomas plotted a jump to a nearby nebula where the dense gas clouds might hide his ship's signature. His hands moved quickly across the controls, but his mind was divided. Part of him was calculating jump coordinates while another part worried about the girl alone in the medical bay. The ship lurched as he engaged the jump drive. He heard a frightened cry from the other room. He found her on the floor, still wrapped in the blanket, her eyes wide with panic. The jump must have scared her. Thomas knelt down a few feet away from her, keeping his distance. He spoke in a soft voice, even though he knew she could not understand the words. Sometimes tone mattered more than language. "It is okay," he said. "We are safe. I will not let them hurt you." She tilted her head, studying him. Her ears moved in ways that seemed deliberate, not random. They pointed forward, then to the side, then flattened, then perked up again. It reminded Thomas of sign language, but with ears instead of hands. He tried to copy the movement, pointing his fingers up near his head and moving them the way her ears had moved. Something amazing happened. She made a sound. Not a cry or a whimper, but something that might have been a word in her language. Her ears did the movement again, slower this time, like she was teaching him. Thomas tried to copy it again. She made a different sound, and this time her tail moved too, curling in a specific pattern. Over the next hour, while his ship hid in the glowing purple clouds of the nebula, Thomas learned that her people communicated as much with body language as with sounds. An ear position could change the meaning of a word completely. A tail movement could ask a question or give an answer. She was trying to teach him and he was trying to learn. He brought her food from his supplies. Simple things like protein bars and dried fruit. She sniffed each item carefully before taking tiny bites. Some things she ate. Others she pushed away with a wrinkle of her nose. Thomas made notes of what she accepted, building a list of safe foods. When he brought her water, she drank the entire container in seconds. He brought more and she drank that too. The pursuit ships passed by the nebula without detecting them. Thomas watched them on his sensors until they disappeared into the distance. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. They had time now. Not much, but enough to figure out their next move. He sat on the floor across from where the girl huddled with her blanket. Thomas pulled out his data pad and started searching through the alien species database again, this time with better information. Golden skin with white markings. Large pointed ears. Empathic abilities suggested by her reactions to his emotions. Tail used for communication. After an hour of searching he found a match. Valrine. Her people were called Valrine. They came from a world in the outer rim where 3 suns kept the planet warm year-round. The database said Valrine were highly empathic, able to sense emotions in other beings. That explained why she seemed to know when he was afraid or trying to help. She could feel his intentions, not just see his actions. The database also said something that made Thomas's stomach turn. 2 years ago, a Valrine colony ship had been attacked by pirates. Thousands of Valrine had been taken and sold into slavery across the galaxy. The interspecies coalition was still trying to find them. This girl was one of the missing. Thomas looked at her with new understanding. She had been stolen from her family. She had probably watched terrible things happen to people she loved. No wonder she was terrified. No wonder she cried. He searched for information about Valrine names and found a list of common ones. He pointed at himself. Thomas, he said clearly. Then he pointed at her and said several Valrine names slowly. Kira? Senna? Lyra? When he said Kira, her ears perked up sharply and she made a sound of recognition. She pointed at herself and repeated it. Kira. Kira, Thomas said and smiled. For the first time since he had found her, she did not look away from his smile. Her tail uncurled slightly, the tip moving in a small pattern that might have meant acknowledgement or maybe even a cautious greeting. They sat together in the quiet medical bay as the ship drifted through the nebula. Thomas showed her pictures from the database of Valrine worlds and people. Every time she saw an image of her own species, her ears would droop with sadness. She touched the screen gently, tracing the outlines of faces that might have been family or friends. Thomas made a promise to himself in that moment. He would find a way to help her. He would get her somewhere safe. And somehow he would help her find her way home. The journey to the Coalition Sanctuary would take 7 days. Thomas had plotted a course that avoided the major shipping lanes where traffickers might have informants watching for his ship. They traveled through quiet sectors of space where few vessels ventured, moving slowly to avoid detection. On the 2nd day, Thomas gave Kira a small cabin with a door that locked from the inside. He wanted her to have privacy and safety, a place where she could feel protected. She stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the bed with clean sheets and the small bathroom attached. Her ears moved through several positions that Thomas was starting to recognize as surprise or disbelief. She had probably not seen kindness like this in a very long time. Thomas also gave her clothes. They were too big, meant for a human adult, but Kira rolled up the sleeves and pant legs until they fit well enough. She wore the soft gray shirt and loose pants like they were the most precious things in the universe. When she looked at herself in the mirror, tears rolled down her face. But these tears seemed different from the frightened ones before. These seemed like relief. By the 3rd day, Kira started coming out of her cabin more often. She would sit in the common area and watch Thomas work on his ship's systems. He talked to her while he worked, explaining what he was doing even though she understood maybe 1 word in 10. His voice seemed to calm her. Her ears would perk forward in a listening position, and sometimes she would make soft sounds back to him. Thomas had printed out papers and given her colored pencils from his supply kit. He thought maybe she could draw if speaking was too difficult. On the 4th day he found her sitting at the table with papers spread everywhere. She had been drawing for hours. The pictures told a story. Thomas sat down across from her and looked at each one carefully. The first drawing showed Valrine people on what looked like a large ship. Happy faces, families together. The second showed the same ship being attacked by larger vessels with weapons firing. The third showed Valrine being separated and locked in different cages. Adults in some cages. Children in others. Thomas's throat felt tight as he looked at these images. Kira had drawn them with careful detail, like she needed to remember every moment even though remembering must have hurt terribly. She pushed another drawing toward him. This one showed 2 young Valrine in a cage together. One was slightly bigger than the other. They were holding hands through the bars. Kira pointed at the larger figure, then at herself. Then she pointed at the smaller one and made a sound that was clearly a name in her language. Her ears drooped low and her tail wrapped around her legs. She touched the smaller figure in the drawing with one finger, so gently, like she was touching something precious and fragile. Thomas understood. This was her brother. They had been taken together and put in the same cage. But then the next drawing showed them being separated. Kira being dragged one direction while her brother was pulled another way. The expression she had drawn on both their faces broke Thomas's heart. She pushed one more drawing across the table. This one showed a place with many buildings and bright lights. Ships coming and going. Some kind of station or trading post. She pointed at it and then at her brother's picture. Her meaning was clear. This was where they had taken him. This was where he still was, or at least where he had been when she last saw him. Thomas pulled out his data pad and started searching. He showed Kira images of different stations and outposts, asking if any looked like her drawing. She looked at each one carefully, her ears moving in patterns he now understood meant no, or not right. After 2 hours of searching, he showed her an image of a massive trading station called Haven's Gate. It was located in neutral territory where all kinds of legal and illegal business happened. Kira's reaction was immediate and strong. She pointed at the screen and made urgent sounds, her whole body leaning forward. Yes, that was the place. Her brother was there or had been there. She looked at Thomas with pleading eyes, her ears in a position that clearly meant hope mixed with desperation. Thomas felt a weight settle on his shoulders. Haven's Gate was dangerous territory. It was controlled by criminal syndicates who did not welcome interference from people like him. Going there would risk both their lives. The smart thing would be to take Kira to the Coalition Sanctuary and let trained professionals handle the rescue operations. But Thomas looked at her face and knew he could not do that. She had already lost everything. Her home, her family, her freedom. Asking her to lose her brother too, to just hope that someday someone might save him, felt wrong. It felt cruel. He started making calls on encrypted channels, reaching out to contacts in the underground networks that helped trafficking victims. These were good people who worked in the shadows, fighting against the slavers and dealers who preyed on the helpless. Thomas had helped them before, using his cargo ship to transport rescued victims to safe locations. Now he needed their help. A woman named Claire Foster responded to his call. She was a coalition enforcement officer who worked on trafficking cases. Thomas explained the situation and sent her Kira's drawings. Claire was quiet for a long moment after seeing them. Haven's Gate is a nightmare, Claire said. But I have been tracking operations there for months. If her brother is still there, I might be able to find him. Give me 2 days. 2 days felt like 2 years. Kira could sense Thomas's tension through her empathic abilities. She stayed close to him, watching him pace the ship's corridors. He tried to teach her more human words to pass the time. Simple things like yes and no, and thank you. She learned quickly, repeating the words carefully with her own unique accent. On the 6th day, Claire called back. She had found something. A boy matching the description from Kira's drawings had been spotted in a holding facility on Haven's Gate. He was scheduled to be moved to another location in 3 days. If they were going to act, it had to be soon. Thomas looked at Kira. She was standing right beside him, listening even though she could not understand most of what Claire was saying. But she knew. Her empathic sense told her this was about her brother. Her ears stood straight up in attention and her tail moved in quick, anxious patterns. We need a plan, Thomas said to Claire. I am bringing her with me. That is a terrible idea, Claire replied. I know, Thomas said. But I am doing it anyway. Kira had been learning words for days. She knew more now than Thomas realized. She stepped forward and looked directly at the communication screen where Claire's image appeared. Kira spoke her first complete human word, the one that meant everything. Please. Her voice was soft and rough from not being used much. But the word was clear. She looked at Thomas and repeated it. Please. Thomas felt something break and reform inside his chest. He nodded at her. Yes, he said. We will get him. I promise. Kira's ears moved through a pattern that meant gratitude so deep there were no words for it. She reached out and took Thomas's hand, holding it tightly. Her empathic sense probably told her everything he was feeling. The fear and the determination and the knowledge that they were about to do something very dangerous. But they would do it together. Haven's Gate looked like a small city floating in space. Thousands of ships docked at its many ports every day, bringing cargo and people from across the galaxy. Some business here was legal. Most was not. The station authorities asked no questions as long as bribes were paid on time. Thomas docked his ship in the lower levels where security was lighter and people minded their own business. Claire Foster was already waiting for them, dressed in plain clothes that would not attract attention. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When she saw Kira, her expression softened. "She should stay on the ship," Claire said quietly to Thomas. Kira's ears flattened against her head. She might not understand all the words, but she knew Claire was talking about leaving her behind. She stepped closer to Thomas and shook her head firmly. "No," she said in human language. "Go. Help." Thomas had taught her those words during their preparation. Kira had practiced them over and over, determined to make herself understood. She touched her chest, then pointed toward the station. Her meaning was absolutely clear. She was going with them whether they liked it or not. Claire sighed but nodded. "Fine. But she stays between us at all times. And if shooting starts, you get her out. Understood?" They moved through the crowded corridors of Haven's Gate like any other visitors. Kira wore a hooded cloak that hid her distinctive ears and tail. Thomas kept one hand on her shoulder, guiding her through the press of bodies. Humans, aliens of a dozen species, and beings he could not identify all pushed past them in the busy marketplace. Kira suddenly stopped walking. Her whole body went rigid. Thomas felt her trembling under his hand. "What is it?" he asked. She closed her eyes and her ears moved beneath the hood in slow, deliberate patterns. When she opened her eyes again, she pointed down a side corridor that led away from the main market. "There," she whispered in her own language. Then in human words, "Feel. Brother." Claire pulled out a small scanner disguised as a data pad. "That direction leads to the industrial sector. Warehouses and storage facilities. If they are keeping victims anywhere, it would be there." They followed Kira as she led them deeper into the station. The crowds thinned out. The lights grew dimmer. This part of Haven's Gate was not meant for visitors. Kira moved with growing confidence now, her empathic senses guiding her like a compass pointing home. She stopped at a heavy metal door with an electronic lock. Claire worked on the lock while Thomas kept watch. The door opened with a soft hiss. Beyond it was a corridor lined with more doors, each one leading to small rooms. Kira moved down the hallway, stopping at each door. At the fifth door, she pressed both hands against the metal and made a sound of pure anguish. Thomas helped Claire break the lock. The door swung open to reveal a room filled with cages. Not just one or two but dozens of them stacked along the walls. Inside were beings of many species. Humans. Belrine. Others Thomas did not recognize. They all looked thin and scared, their eyes hollow with hopelessness. In a small cage near the back, a young Valrine boy sat with his knees pulled up to his chest. He had the same golden skin and white markings as Kira, the same large ears and expressive tail. When he saw Kira, his ears shot straight up and he made a cry that was half sob, half joy. "Ren?" Kira ran to his cage and thrust her hands through the bars. The boy grabbed them and held on like he would never let go. They pressed their foreheads together, making sounds in their own language that needed no translation. Brother and sister reunited after being torn apart. Thomas and Claire worked frantically on the locks, freeing the captives as fast as they could. But the noise had attracted attention. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Voices shouted orders. The traffickers had discovered the break-in. "Get them out the back way," Claire said, pulling a weapon from under her jacket. "I called for backup. Coalition forces are on their way, but we need to hold this position." The door burst open and armed men rushed in. Claire fired and one went down. Thomas grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it at another man who got too close. The freed captives screamed and tried to hide behind the cages. Kira pulled her brother behind her, shielding him with her own body. More traffickers poured into the room. Thomas fought desperately, but he was not a soldier. A large man grabbed him and threw him against the wall. Stars exploded in Thomas's vision. Through the haze, he saw the man raising a weapon, pointing it at Kira and her brother. Then the entire station shook with a massive impact. The lights flickered and alarms began blaring. Coalition ships had arrived and were breaching the station's outer hull. Armed officers in tactical gear stormed through every entrance, moving with practiced precision. The traffickers tried to fight but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Within minutes, the battle was over. Coalition soldiers secured the room and began helping the freed captives. Medical teams rushed in with blankets and emergency supplies. Claire lowered her weapon and wiped blood from a cut on her forehead. "Is everyone all right?" Thomas nodded, though his whole body ached. He looked around the room at all the cages that had been opened, at all the people who had been locked away and were now free. There were so many of them. Dozens in this room alone, and reports were coming in of other rooms being discovered throughout the station. Kira sat on the floor with her brother in her arms, rocking him gently while he cried. Ren looked so small and fragile, his fur matted and dirty. But he was alive. He was safe. His little hands clutched Kira's shirt like he feared she might disappear if he let go. A coalition medic approached them carefully. "We need to check them for injuries," she said softly. Kira looked at Thomas. Her eyes were wet with tears, but her ears were in a position he had learned meant gratitude deeper than words could express. She reached out one hand to him. Thomas took it and squeezed gently. "You found him," Thomas said. "You saved him." Kira's human vocabulary was still limited, but she managed 2 words that said everything. "Thank you." The coalition officers began the long process of documenting evidence and taking statements. They found records showing that over 300 beings had passed through this facility in the past year. Some had been sold and shipped to other locations. But many were still here, locked in rooms throughout the industrial sector. By the time the sun rose on the planet below Haven's Gate, every cage had been opened. Every lock had been broken. Every captive had been freed. And Kira held her brother close, whispering promises in their own language that no one would ever separate them again. 3 months had passed since the raid on Haven's Gate. Thomas stood outside the Coalition Rehabilitation Center on a peaceful planet called New Terra, watching the twin suns set over rolling green hills. It was hard to believe that such beauty existed in the same galaxy as places like that terrible station. The center was home to over 200 survivors rescued from Haven's Gate and other trafficking operations. It had gardens where people could walk and think, therapy rooms where they could heal, and classrooms where they could learn new skills. The coalition had built it specifically for beings who needed time and safety to recover from their trauma. Thomas visited every week. He had become an official volunteer with the coalition, using his ship to transport supplies and help with rescue operations. But mostly he came to see Kira and Ren. He found them in the garden, sitting under a large tree with purple leaves. Ren was drawing with colored pencils while Kira read from a human language textbook. She had been studying hard, determined to speak fluently. When she saw Thomas approaching, her ears perked up in the happy greeting he had come to recognize as her smile. "Thomas," she called out, standing up. Her human speech had improved dramatically. She still had an accent and sometimes struggled with difficult words, but she could hold entire conversations now. "You are early today." "I finished my delivery run ahead of schedule," Thomas said, sitting down on the grass beside them. "How are your studies going?" Kira showed him her textbook with pride. "I finished chapter 12. Next week I start advanced grammar." She laughed at herself. "Grammar is very confusing. Why do humans have so many rules for one language?" Ren looked up from his drawing and waved shyly at Thomas. The young boy was still recovering, still learning to trust again. He spoke very little, even in his own language. But he was getting better. His fur had grown back healthy and shiny. His eyes had lost some of their haunted look. And he smiled sometimes now, which was something he had not done for the first month after his rescue. "I have something for you," Thomas said, pulling a small package from his bag. "It arrived at my ship this morning." Kira opened the package carefully. Inside was an official document with the coalition seal. Her hands trembled as she read it. Thomas watched her ears move through several different positions, expressing emotions that shifted from disbelief to joy to something like determination. "They want me to testify," she said quietly. "At the trial. Against the people who took us." The trial had been scheduled for next month. Coalition prosecutors had built a case against 73 individuals involved in the trafficking operation. Station officials who had accepted bribes. Ship captains who had transported victims. Dealers who had sold people like they were cargo. And at the center of it all, the crime bosses who had organized everything. "You do not have to do it," Thomas said gently. "They have enough evidence without your testimony." Kira shook her head, her ears moving in a position that meant firm resolve. "No. I want to do this. They need to hear from someone they hurt. They need to see that we are not just numbers in their account books. We are people. We have names and families and futures." She looked at Ren, who had gone back to his drawing. "If I speak, maybe it helps other victims speak too. Maybe it gives them courage." Thomas felt pride swell in his chest. 3 months ago, Kira had been too terrified to make eye contact. Now she was volunteering to face her captors in court. The strength it took to make that choice was incredible. "I will be there," Thomas promised. "In the courtroom. You will not be alone." "I know," Kira said and touched his hand briefly. "You have never left us alone." Over the next weeks, Kira prepared for her testimony with help from coalition lawyers. They practiced questions and answers. They reviewed what she would see and hear in the courtroom. Thomas attended every preparation session, offering support and encouragement. The day of the trial arrived cold and gray. Thomas wore his best clothes and sat in the public gallery where Kira could see him. When she entered the courtroom, she walked with her head high and her ears in a confident position. She wore a simple blue dress and had a translator device that would help the court understand her words. The defendants sat in a row behind protective barriers. They looked at Kira with expressions ranging from boredom to contempt. They still did not see her as a person. Even now, even here, she was nothing to them. But Kira looked at each of them directly and began to speak. She told them about her life before the attack. About her family on the colony ship, traveling to a new world full of hope. About her brother's laughter and her mother's songs. She told them about the day the pirates came, about watching her parents die trying to protect their children. About being locked in cages and treated like animals. Her voice never wavered. Her ears stayed in positions that showed strength and determination. When the defense lawyers tried to interrupt or object, she waited patiently and then continued her story. She spoke for 2 hours, making sure every detail was recorded, every crime was documented. When she finished, there was silence in the courtroom. Even the judge looked moved. The jury members had tears in their eyes. And the defendants, for the first time, looked uncomfortable. They could not ignore her anymore. She had made them see her humanity and in doing so, had made them confront their own cruelty. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, all 73 defendants were found guilty. The sentences ranged from 20 years to life imprisonment. The trafficking network was broken. Hundreds of victims would be found and freed because of the evidence collected during the investigation. After the trial ended, Kira enrolled in the coalition's counseling program. She wanted to help other survivors heal from their trauma. The program director said she was a natural, that her empathic abilities combined with her own experiences made her uniquely qualified to understand what others were going through. Ren started school at the center's education facility. He was learning mathematics and science and art. His drawings had become more hopeful, showing bright colors and happy scenes instead of the dark images he had created at first. He talked more now, even made a few friends among the other young survivors. Thomas continued his work with the coalition, running rescue missions and transporting survivors to safety. But no matter where his ship took him, he always came back to New Terra. Every week without fail, he visited Kira and Ren in their garden under the purple-leaved tree. One evening, as the twin suns set in brilliant orange and gold, Kira gave Thomas a gift. It was a bracelet woven from colorful threads in traditional Valrine style. She tied it around his wrist with careful hands. "This means family," she explained. "Not family by blood but family by choice. You saved us. You gave us our lives back. That makes you our brother in all the ways that matter." Thomas looked at the bracelet through blurred vision. He had started this journey as a simple cargo pilot trying to do the right thing. He had not expected to find a family. But here they were, 3 beings from different worlds, bound together by circumstances that had tried to break them but instead had made them stronger. Rin came over and hugged Thomas tightly. The boy still did not speak much, but his actions said everything. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas sat with his chosen family and knew that some bonds could never be broken. Not by distance, not by time, not by anything. They had found each other in the darkest of places, and together they had found their way into the light.